Hey, it's Rachel. It is a beautiful early fall morning here at the end of September. Thought I would give you guys a quick garden tour, but I'm going to start outside the garden showing you what's been going on with the buckwheat meadow. I have been going through laboriously and cleaning out all of this buckwheat, bundling it and clipping it to the interior cattle panel fence to dry out. Once these are fully dry, I will thresh them, winnow it, and collect the grain. I will dedicate a whole video to the topic of growing buckwheat at home and what I did and what worked and what didn't once this whole thing is finished and I see what the yield looks like. But the short version is, so far, I'm not loving this. As usual, it probably comes down to user error on my part and the way that I tried to execute this. But long story short, I think there are better ways that I could use this space next year, as opposed to dedicating it to growing buckwheat as a grain. I still like buckwheat a ton as a pollinator plant, and I will continue to use it as such, but I don't think I'm going to grow it all the way to the grain stage next year. Back in the interior of the garden, I will quickly cover 6 of my 10 beds because they don't have a whole lot going on. Cover those guys off quickly, and I will start here in the south end of the garden. The south half of my roots bed was where I had my onions in the spring and summer. Those were harvested out and have now been replaced with fall carrots, planted along my drip irrigation lines in rows. It's pretty easy to go through with a stirrup hoe and get weeds as I need to in between those rows of carrots. The north side of the bed was beets and carrots previously. It has now been planted with a cover crop, just slowly starting to come in. Around Halloween, I will terminate this cover crop and cover the whole thing with leaves. And then down at the end there in the walkway, I have a volunteer bean plant. Still no idea how that happened, but it appears to be some kind of bush drying bean. I've decided to let that stay in place, and I'm harvesting out those pods as soon as they are ready. Just across the aisle, we have the sweet potato bed. This is just completely overrun with sweet potatoes, as well as another volunteer bean plant. This was a vining one. I leaned a leftover cattle panel here against the fence to get it up and out of the way. And otherwise, I've let this bed just be completely consumed by the sweet potato vines. I'll harvest these once we start getting closer to our first frost in the fall, which for me is mid-October. I thought I would have had more to report on the broccoli bed because I had expected that by now I would have terminated broccoli and reset this bed with a cover crop. But good news, green magic broccoli has just kept right on going. This plant is determined to reproduce, and I respect and admire its ambition. Anytime I cut off a floret, it just flowers again, and consequently I have not needed to terminate this bed. I'm still getting really good harvests of broccoli off of it, and I'm going to leave it in place as long as humanly possible. A lot of these guys are still throwing off nice tight little domed heads, and I will continue to harvest those side shoots. But I will say, as you kind of walk down the bed here, in addition to these nice ones, I am also starting to see these more bolted looking ones. So as the plants start to do this, I will cut them off at the ground, but for as long as possible, I really will leave this in place and just keep harvesting off these little florets. Now the variety for sure is a huge factor here. Green magic, I will definitely plant this broccoli again, but also this bean tunnel under which I'm currently standing has played a big role. This is a 16-foot cattle panel arched across the 7-foot wide bed. These are Good Mother Sollard. It's a kind of cranberry pinto type bean. I will harvest these as the pods mature. No rush on that, I can just wait until they're ready. And in the meantime, it is creating a really lovely shady microclimate that has for sure helped to delay the bolting of all the broccoli in this bed. This particular combination of green magic broccoli and a bean tunnel overhead, I will definitely be doing again next year. Moving further north, the Brussels and Kale bed, also not a ton to report. It's producing. They're doing well. With this time of year, there really are very few cabbage moths flitting around, and consequently, I was able to remove the cover over these and just let them continue to grow and size up. Still getting great harvests off of the kale, and if you look on the Brussels, you can see I'm starting to get harvests off of the bottom there, and as these sprouts size up, I'll continue to harvest and work my way up the plants. My bed in the northeast corner was bush drying beans, black cocoa in particular. On the north half, those have, for the most part, finished and been harvested out of here. I left a couple of plants in place because they still had a few pods that were ripening, but for the most part, I've cleaned out the north half of the bed. The south half of that bed has my melons and squash, and you can see I have placed a slitted plastic cover over this. This creates a nice hot microclimate underneath, and I did that because as we're moving into fall, our daytime temperatures are dipping a bit. It's more in the 60 to 70 Fahrenheit range lately. That's not warm enough for these to really ripen up, and using this slitted plastic row cover gives me a warmer microclimate underneath it. Now, I did not secure the bottoms. So you can see I've secured the sheeting probably about halfway down the sides here. And I did that intentionally so that the bottoms are open and you can get a decent amount of airflow to go through and ventilate. As you can see, first thing in the morning, there is quite a bit of dew and condensation on these, and I don't want to have damp, wet conditions under there. It looks pretty wet right now, but by about 10 or 11 in the morning, this does dry out nicely. And throughout the day, I can see the plastic billowing as air moves through it. So it's decent ventilation, but it does create a warmer area underneath to help these crops ripen. And if I peek underneath, you can see I have my butternut squash resting on these little platforms to keep them up and off the soil. Same with that squash back there. And I've done the same for my cantaloupes to try and keep them all dry, off the soil, and free of rot. The bed in the northwest corner is what I call my fallow bed. I do treat the 10th year in my rotation as a fallow year, but that said, I just can't quite help myself, and it's not truly fallow. It was planted with a spring cover crop and just left alone for most of the growing season. That terminated crop is the debris you see left on the surface of the soil as a mulch. I did cover the whole bed in another bean tunnel, so it's not technically fallow, but these Cherokee Trail of Tears beans are setting a glorious amount of pods. When these mature and are harvested out, I will cut all those plants off at the base along the trellis on both sides. And as they decompose in the soil, those roots will release nitrogen to the bed. So it's almost like having a cover crop in the sense that it helps to build the soil health, but I get a yield off of it. And then I use this bed as my winter brassica bed. At the end of the growing season, I plant this out with some of my winter hardy brassicas that I will hope to harvest out by probably end of November. So I have Napa cabbage over on this side and some broccoli slowly sizing up over on this side. And I'm going to let them stay in place and size up through the winter. The cane fruit beds continue to be in heavy production. One of my blackberry plants is absolutely draped in flora cane fruits and is still heavily producing. Just waiting for these guys to ripen, go in every day and pick a few. The other blackberry plant in here has an earlier fruit set and harvest, and consequently, I've been able to start removing the spent flora canes from this one, and you can see just my primo canes that are left in place. So I'll continue to go through, remove these spent flora canes as this plant finishes, and just prune this up nicely for next year. It'll make it easier to harvest next year, and in the interim, it gives a lot more light to the strawberries underneath. The update on the strawberries is that I am capturing runners by putting down some of these pots. And as the strawberries set their runners in late summer, early fall, I can land them into pots with the ultimate goal of moving them into a gutter garden next year. The good news is the cane fruits have established themselves thoroughly and they're really taking over these beds completely. That's great. It does mean the strawberries at this point in my garden's life are starting to be shaded out. And rather than keep them here, I'm capturing these runners so that I can relocate them into a gutter garden that I will attach to my interior fence so that the strawberries can have more direct sun and be up and off the ground away from any slug damage. Similar deal with the raspberries, except in this case, the harvest that I'm getting is the primo cane harvest. This is an everbearing raspberry. These are my first year canes and they're developing fruits out at their tips. Once the primo cane harvest is finished, I will cut these back probably by about half and leave them in place to become flora canes for next year's flora cane harvest in the summer. And similarly, you can see the strawberries down below. I'm using those pots to capture the runners with the goal of establishing that gutter garden. The blueberry bed has very little happening, as expected. These are replacement plants for my original ones that were eaten to the ground by something hungry. Consequently, I do have them protected with these hoops and some bird netting just to keep rabbits or deer or whatever it was off of them while they size up. But I'm not expecting any kind of crop off of these for a few years. That's fine, we can be patient. I do have a little more to report when it comes to the chicken run. You can see behind me. I use their run as my primary compost area. I toss weeds, pruning, and any leftover bits of produce that we're not going to use into the run and let the ladies go crazy in here. As a result, I get quite a bit of compost out of it. A couple weeks ago, I did clean out the run and sift through that compost as part of some of the tomato bed activity I'll tell you about in a second. Everything that was left over got thrown into this bin and is being left in place. It is currently the fall of 2025, and this will eventually be the 2026 compost bin. After I cleaned out all of the compost from the run, I went to our local free municipal mulch area and picked up 2 pickup bed loads of wood chips, which I dumped into the space. The ladies have since done what they do and scratched and tossed those around, spread them through the space pretty evenly. That is now there as a carbonaceous layer to absorb their droppings as well as these nitrogen-rich materials that I toss into the run. And together, those 2 things will start to make another batch of great compost for the garden. The roses that I put in place did survive, to my pleasant surprise. The mesh tile backing sheets we had left over from the house build that I used as a protection device did work. In particular, the one at the end there has really started to take off, and these other 2 are beginning to size up. Those will hopefully grow up over the north side of this cattle panel and create a lovely visual screen from the street. Down there at the end, you can see coming out of the bed that's on the east side of my shed, I did have a Lady Godiva pumpkin vine. It only produced 1 fruit before something killed it. You can see that vine died off pretty quickly. I'm not sure what got to it, but it did produce 1 pumpkin for me. I've left that in place. And then I have a butternut squash vine I don't even remember planting, but it has produced several fruits as well. The main thing I do at this time of year, you can probably see if you look closely, I use some mesh produce bags to secure those heavier squash and pumpkin fruits to the cattle panel trellis, just to make sure that as they ripen, they don't fall off and explode on the ground below. Although I'm sure you guys would not mind that in the slightest. Their coop is down at the east end of that run, adjacent to the entrance to the garden. I did start to partially close off that big ventilation door on the south side, just with a piece of cardboard for now. I'll find something more weather resistant for the winter, but for now this works well. They still get a little bit of ventilation going through there, but as the temperatures have cooled down, I don't need to have quite so much air running through it, and they seem to appreciate a little bit more darkness and privacy in there. The coop bedding, I would not sift and put straight onto the garden. This is really drenched in chicken droppings and it would burn plants. As the leaves from these big mature oak and maples on our property begin to fall in earnest and we collect several bags of them, I will go through, clean out the bedding in here, replace it with several bags full of bone dry leaves to act as their winter bedding, and the bedding that's currently in there will be moved into this mostly empty compost bin, and it will be the 2027 compost. All right, let's talk about the 4 beds where things are happening in a big way this time of year. One is this polyculture bed. I have a tunnel that grows my vining crops like fresh beans, tromboncino, my vining summer squash. You can see back there, I officially cannot keep up with this squash. Public service announcement, you only need 1 tromboncino plant. That is 1 plant, just to be clear, that I put on this trellis. Do not plant more than 1 of these puppies. The south side of the bed, I cleaned out all of the spring greens when I put down this drip irrigation system, and I've since planted out lettuces along that drip irrigation line and arugula mixed with giant red mustard along this irrigation line. The northernmost line is still running at the base of my chard plants, and I'm leaving those in place to continue sizing up for winter harvests. Now the experiment I'm kind of excited about this year, probably insane, it's probably a bad idea, but I'm excited to try it. I'm going to convert this into a high tunnel. The plan is to cover it with greenhouse plastic that will go up and over the whole frame, and then make some end walls out of the same plastic. This is going to be a serious sewing project on my part, as well as some structural supports underneath to keep it from collapsing in the snow. I don't know, wish me luck, but I'm excited to at least experiment with this. The other 3 beds with major updates are all close to the polytunnel. This was my potato bed. If you've seen some of my prior videos, you know that I like to plant a cover crop right around this time of year, let it grow, terminate it around Halloween, and cover it with dried leaves. I leave that in place to break down, condense, and become a nice shield over the soil for next year. I did harvest this potato bed. It had the same leftover cover crop and leaf debris on top of it. And because I had to dig up the whole bed to harvest the potatoes anyway, I took that as an opportunity to bury and turn under those debris deep in the soil. I then seeded the whole bed with a cover crop, raked it smooth, watered that in, and replaced my drip irrigation lines. Side-by-side comparison, this is what the bed looks like before, and that's after. And you can now see several weeks later, this cover crop is really well established and growing well. Right around Halloween this year, I'll repeat the whole process, meaning this will get terminated, covered in bags of dry leaves, and left in place to become a nice mulch layer for next year. My 2 tomato and pepper beds that you can see behind me had a really different approach. Because those plants are not dug up when they're harvested, the sequence was a little bit different. At the very end of August, Labor Day weekend, I did a final big harvest of all of my paste tomatoes. I then cut the plants off at the base, leaving the roots to decompose in the soil, and I cut the vines apart and put them into our compost bin. My son and I then removed the T-post and nylon netting trellises that we had in place. We used a length of PVC pipe, secured the short end of the netting and rolled it up, removing the zip ties that held it in place from those T-posts, lifted up those drip irrigation lines out of the way. We removed the T-post trellises from the bed, used a stirrup hoe to quickly weed the bed, and then a bow rake to distribute that debris evenly across the surface of the soil. We opened up the 2025 compost bin and discovered some volunteer carrots in the process, emptied out that compost, sifted it into the wheelbarrows to get a nice fine sifted compost. We then carefully placed that compost on the surface of those cover crop debris, almost like a lasagna, creating a layer of the leftover debris from last year, fresh compost from this year, and then a cover crop that I seeded into the top of that compost, raked it in, watered my son a little bit in the process at his request, and then replaced the drip irrigation. There is our before, after 7 hours of work. I've added a good 3 inches of rich compost on either sides of the bed. My drip irrigation's back in place safely. Everything has been seeded with a cover crop, ready to go. And if I zoom in, you can see this cover crop is now also getting established. The potatoes are obviously way ahead when it comes to their cover crop establishment, but we're a good 5 weeks away from Halloween at this point, and that's enough time for these to start sizing up and creating a nice shield once I terminate them and cover them in leaves. Now the peppers are still, as you can see, maturing. You can see some of my yellow ones here. Still streaks of green on these. They're not quite ready to go. I may cover these with slitted film, much like I did the melon bed. So far, I don't feel like I've needed to. They are maturing. I'm seeing them turning color every day. As those plants finish ripening, I will cut them off at the base and leave their roots to decompose in the soil. That is it for the early fall garden tour. I'll do a follow-up video in probably another 6 or 7 weeks to show you all the process of terminating the cover crops and covering with leaves, as well as some of the progress on our fall harvest, like the sweet potatoes, the winter squash, the final drying bean harvest, and hopefully some sizing up of those winter brassicas, as well as the probably too ambitious high tunnel project. We'll see if I actually get that one done. I hope in the meantime these tours are helpful and interesting. As always, if you have any questions or if there's anything I didn't cover, please do drop a comment below and I'll do my best to answer. Until next time, thanks.